Imagine you're a hunter-gatherer. It's 12,000 years ago. The Ice Age is slowly, painfully winding down. You're sitting around a campfire somewhere in what will one day become Utah, but right now it's a vast wetland, marshes, waterfowl, cold air, and absolutely zero Netflix. You just ate some duck. You've got stone spears lying next to you. You've walked probably 15 kilometers today. Life is honestly pretty brutal and also pretty boring, and those two things might be connected. And then somebody reaches into their pouch, pulls out some dried leaves they picked up from a hillside a day's walk away, throws them on the fire, leans forward, and takes a long, deep breath. That's the oldest thing we know. That's the earliest moment we can point to and say, yeah, humans and tobacco, this is where it started. Not in a tobacco field, not in a factory, not in a doctor's office where someone is handing you a prescription and calling it medicine. An Ice Age campfire, duck bones on the ground, and 4 tiny charred tobacco seeds sitting in the ashes. And here's the thing that keeps me up at night. That wasn't yesterday. That wasn't ancient Rome, or ancient Greece, or ancient Egypt. That was 12,300 years ago. To give you a sense of scale, the pyramids are roughly 4,500 years old. These people were using tobacco almost 3 times before the first pyramid stone was laid. Agriculture itself only started around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. These people were messing with nicotine before humanity had even invented farming. In 2015, an archaeologist named Darren Duke was doing a routine survey in the Great Salt Lake Desert in Utah. Standard work. Dry, flat, aggressively uninteresting terrain. And then he spotted what he later described as a little black smudge on the open mud flats. No golden idol, no ancient temple, no dramatic music sting, just a smudge. A small, dark mark on dry ground that most people would walk right past without a second thought. But that smudge turned out to be the remains of an ancient fireplace. And when Duke and his team excavated it properly, brought everything back to the lab, and started going through the material carefully, their botanist noticed something in the debris. 4 tiny seeds. Seeds from a wild tobacco plant, specifically a species called Nicotiana attenuata, a wild desert tobacco that still grows in the region today. The seeds were too small to date directly, so the team used radiocarbon dating on 3 separate samples of burned wood from the same hearth. The results came back. Approximately 12,300 years old. Stone Age. End of the Pleistocene. Still technically the Ice Age, though the glaciers were retreating. At that point, the previous record for earliest known tobacco use was around 3,000 years ago, from ceramic pipes found in Alabama that tested positive for nicotine residue. That was the baseline. That was what the entire scientific community had agreed was the starting point of human tobacco use. And then one single excavation in Utah demolished that number and pushed it back by 9,000 years. Almost overnight, everything we thought we knew about when this started had to be completely rewritten. Around the same fireplace, alongside those 4 seeds, researchers found more than 2,000 bone fragments, mostly from ducks and other waterfowl. They found stone spear tips used to hunt large game. They found a bone implement, seeds from several edible wetland plants, and charred willow wood that had probably been the fuel for the fire itself. This was a busy, functioning camp. People were cooking here, working here, living here, and in the middle of all of it, somebody had tobacco. Now, nobody knows for certain how they were using it. The seeds are too small to smoke on their own. Based on similar practices found in caves just 65 kilometers away from the site, archaeologists believe the most likely explanation is chewing. People would twist tobacco leaves, stems, and plant fibers together into a ball, a quid, and chew or suck on it, spitting out the seeds, some of which landed in the fire. It's not the romantic image of a pipe being passed around a campfire, but it worked. And more importantly, they knew it worked, because the plants were gathered from hillsides and mountains at least 13 kilometers away. Nobody walks 13 kilometers through Ice Age terrain to collect something that doesn't do anything for you. They knew what tobacco was, they knew what it felt like, and they thought it was worth the trip. That detail is everything, because it tells you that this wasn't accidental. This wasn't some confused person accidentally eating the wrong plant and deciding it was fine. This was intentional collection, intentional transport, and intentional use of a plant specifically for its effects on the human mind. Before farming, before civilization, Before we had written any of this down, we were already chasing that feeling. Fast forward several thousand years. The Ice Age is over. Humans have figured out agriculture. Cities are starting to form. And tobacco begins showing up in contexts that are dramatically more elaborate, more structured, and honestly more fascinating than anything you'd expect. Welcome to Mesoamerica, and specifically, welcome to the Maya. The Maya had a relationship with tobacco that I can only describe as profoundly, spiritually, cosmologically serious. For them, tobacco was not a social habit. It was not something you did after dinner to relax. It was a direct line of communication to the divine. Mayan priests smoked tobacco in pipes and rolled it into cigars, sometimes wrapped in bark, sometimes in leaves, during religious ceremonies. They believed, with total conviction, that the smoke was the voice of the sacred traveling between worlds. That exhaling smoke was literally sending prayers upward, toward the gods. Not metaphorically, literally. The smoke was the message. Temple reliefs at the ancient city of Palenque show priests smoking, mid-ceremony. That's not decorative stonework. That's documentation. That's someone saying, this is what we do, this is who we are, and this is important enough to carve into our most sacred buildings. Tobacco smoke was used to purify ceremonial spaces before rituals began. It was used in divination, the attempt to read the future or communicate with spirits. It was used in healing practices. It was burned on altars as an offering to deities. The Maya believed tobacco had the power to open the boundary between the human world and the spirit world, to allow those with the right training and preparation to cross that boundary, if only briefly and if only in perception. Smoking wasn't recreational. Smoking was theology made physical. Scientists from Washington State University analyzed the contents of ancient Maya drug containers, small vessels buried over 1,000 years ago on Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, and found chemical traces of not one, but two distinct types of cured tobacco, Nicotiana tabacum and Nicotiana rustica. And mixed in with it? Mexican marigold. The researchers believe the marigold was added to make the smoke smoother and more pleasant, which means that over 1,000 years ago, the Maya were already experimenting with blended, flavored, carefully curated tobacco mixtures. They were, in some sense, inventing the concept of the premium tobacco experience, 1,000 years before anyone put a brand logo on a cigarette pack. And then there's the part of Maya tobacco history that nobody really wants to talk about, but is genuinely important to understanding how seriously they took this substance. Archaeological and ethnographic sources both document the use of tobacco in enemas during certain ceremonies. But stay with me because the logic is actually coherent. The goal was maximum absorption speed. They wanted the effects to arrive as fast and as intensely as possible, especially during high-stakes ritual contexts. And that method, as physiologically unfortunate as it sounds, delivered exactly that: rapid onset, intense effect, complete alteration of conscious experience. For a culture that believed these altered states were the actual mechanism of communication with the divine, making the experience stronger and faster wasn't excess. It was dedication. These were not casual users. These were people who had built an entire cosmological framework around what tobacco could do to the human mind, and who were willing to explore every possible method of achieving those effects in service of that framework. Across the rest of the Americas, in culture after culture, tobacco was everywhere, and treated with consistent reverence. In North American Plains cultures, tobacco was smoked in sacred pipes, and the act of sharing a pipe was a binding ritual that accompanied treaties, ceremonies, and solemn agreements. The smoke rising from those pipes wasn't atmosphere, it was a witness. It meant the agreement was being witnessed by forces beyond the human participants. The Huichol people of present-day Mexico used tobacco smoke as an offering to nature spirits and goddesses. In the Pacific Northwest, nicotine and cotinine residues have been extracted directly from stone smoking pipes at archaeological sites, showing tobacco use was firmly established there among hunter-gatherer communities. In what is now Arizona, ancestral Puebloans were chewing wild tobacco between 1,000 and 2,000 years ago. In South America, tobacco was mixed with other plants to create complex psychoactive preparations used by shamans during healing sessions and spiritual journeys. The Nicotiana genus itself is native to the Andean region of South America, and spread northward through the continent largely on the back of religious practice and trade networks. Not agriculture, not commerce, not warfare. Religion. People wanted it for their ceremonies, and so it traveled. Everywhere you looked across the pre-Columbian Americas, tobacco was present, and it was treated with a seriousness and a reverence that we completely and utterly lost once the Western world got involved. And then comes 1492, and everything changes. Christopher Columbus lands in the Caribbean. The Taino people greet him and his crew with gifts: fruit, food, spears, goodwill, and also dried tobacco leaves. Columbus, being Columbus, had absolutely no idea what to do with them. They weren't edible. They smelled strange. He threw them overboard. A man has just arrived from Europe after a multi-month ocean crossing, been handed one of the most consequential plants in human history, and his response was to throw it in the sea. Iconic in the worst possible way. A month later on Cuba, two of his crew members, Rodrigo de Jerez and Luis de Torres, watched local people doing something they had genuinely never seen before: inhaling smoke through a tube made from a Y-shaped plant stem with the two upper ends inserted in the nostrils and the bottom end held over burning leaves. The crew described it as drinking smoke. The European word smoking didn't exist yet in any language. The concept was so foreign they didn't even have vocabulary for it. Rodrigo de Jerez decided to try it anyway. He liked it. He kept doing it. He became, depending on your perspective, either the first European pioneer of tobacco or the first European victim of nicotine, and honestly, both descriptions are accurate. He got hooked, and when the expedition returned to Spain, he brought his habit home with him, smoking openly in his hometown of Ayamonte. The Spanish Inquisition saw him blowing smoke from his mouth and nose and reached the obvious conclusion: only the devil could make a man exhale smoke from his face. They arrested him, threw him in prison. Rodrigo de Jerez, the first European smoker in recorded history, spent several years in an Inquisition jail cell for the crime of enjoying tobacco. And here is the beautiful, absurd punchline. By the time he was released, smoking had already become fashionable across Spain. While he was locked up, the habit had spread. Everyone was doing it. He went to jail as a suspected agent of the devil and came out as merely a slightly early adopter. History doesn't always have clean lessons, but sometimes it has perfect jokes. The spread of tobacco through Europe was not gradual. It was explosive. Within decades of Columbus's first voyage, tobacco had jumped from Spain to Portugal, France, England, the Ottoman Empire, and beyond. And crucially, this is the part that explains how it moved so fast. It spread not primarily as a pleasure drug, but as medicine. Physicians recommended it. Tobacco was prescribed for headaches, respiratory problems, digestive ailments, pain management, and general fatigue. The logic, such as it was, amounted to, it clearly does something to the human body. Therefore, it must be medicinal, which is not sound reasoning, but which was also basically how European medicine operated for centuries, so no individual should feel too superior about it. The plant's most powerful European champion in the 16th century was Catherine de' Medici, the French queen who suffered from severe chronic migraines. Her physician, a YCCC diplomat named Jean Nicot, prescribed tobacco as a treatment, specifically in the form of snuff, finely powdered tobacco inhaled through the nostrils. Catherine became such a devoted advocate for the plant, promoting it throughout the French court and beyond, that when scientists centuries later finally isolated the primary active compound in tobacco, they named it after him: nicotine, named after Jean Nicot, named after the doctor who gave it to the queen with the headaches. The same word that now appears on warning labels, cessation products, addiction research papers, and public health campaigns worldwide was originally a tribute to a 16th century royal migraine remedy. That's not irony. That's history being completely unhinged. Within 70 years of Columbus's landing, tobacco had reached every inhabited continent on Earth. Not just Europe, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, Persia, China, Japan, sub-Saharan Africa, all within 7 decades, faster than perhaps any other agricultural commodity in the entire history of human trade. And that speed wasn't just because people found it enjoyable, it's because once people started, stopping was extraordinarily difficult. The plant had evolved over millions of years, a chemistry that made human brains want more of it. Nicotine binds to receptors in the brain that regulate dopamine. The relief when you don't have it creates a craving that feels identical to genuine need. The plant had, in a very real sense, figured out how to make humans distribute it across the globe. We thought we were spreading tobacco. Tobacco was spreading us. Colonialism and tobacco became completely, inseparably entangled. The English colony of Jamestown, founded in Virginia in 1607, was nearly a catastrophic failure. Disease, starvation, violent conflict. The colony teetered on the edge of collapse for years. And then a merchant named John Rolfe planted a hybrid tobacco strain in 1610. Within a few years, Virginia was shipping tobacco to England in quantities that made everyone involved very wealthy. Tobacco didn't just save Jamestown. Tobacco essentially funded the British colonial experiment in North America. The entire economic foundation of early American settlement ran on that plant, and that success came at a human cost so severe it's almost impossible to fully absorb. Tobacco cultivation required vast amounts of grueling, backbreaking labor. The plantation system expanded rapidly. Demand for labor that couldn't be met by European settlers led directly to the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. The tobacco economy became one of the primary economic drivers of one of the greatest atrocities in human history. The sacred ceremonial plant of the Maya, the huichol, the Puebloans, the plant that hunter-gatherers had walked 13 kilometers across Ice Age marshland to collect for their rituals, became the economic engine of enslavement. Same plant. Completely unrecognizable history. By the 1800s, tobacco had cycled through pipes, cigars, chewing tobacco, snuff, and every conceivable variation, but the form that would define the 20th century hadn't fully arrived yet. Then, in the 1880s, the cigarette machine was invented. One machine could produce 200 cigarettes a minute. Prices collapsed. Availability exploded. Cigarettes became cheap enough that almost anyone could afford them daily. And then the advertising industry got involved, and things got genuinely dark in ways that would take decades to fully understand. Tobacco companies discovered that war was, from a business perspective, a spectacular marketing opportunity. During World War I and World War II, cigarettes were shipped to frontline soldiers by the millions, for free. They were included in military rations alongside food, ammunition, and medical supplies. The rationale offered was that cigarettes helped soldiers manage stress, maintain alertness, stay calm under fire. Companies framed it as support for the troops. The reality was that they were creating hundreds of thousands of addicted consumers who would still be buying their product when they came home from war, if they came home from war. Cigarettes were prescribed to recovering soldiers in hospitals. Smoke rings were blown in the direction of enemy lines. It was simultaneously a public health catastrophe and one of the most effective marketing campaigns in corporate history. By the 1920s, tobacco companies were marketing aggressively to women, creating campaigns specifically designed to associate smoking with independence, femininity, and modernity. The number of female smokers in the United States tripled within 15 years. Doctors appeared in cigarette advertisements endorsing specific brands for throat health. People smoked in hospitals, on airplanes, in restaurants, in schools. At the peak, somewhere around half of all American adults smoked regularly. And then the science arrived, and kept arriving, and would not stop. We now know things about tobacco that would be completely incomprehensible to the Mayan priest standing in the smoke of a temple in Palenque, or to the Ice Age hunter-gatherer leaning over a fire in a Utah wetland. We know nicotine is among the most addictive substances the human brain can encounter. We know tobacco smoke contains thousands of chemical compounds, dozens of which are carcinogenic. We know that smoking causes lung cancer, throat cancer, mouth cancer, bladder cancer, heart disease, stroke, emphysema, and a list of conditions that fills entire medical textbooks. We know that globally, tobacco-related causes kill approximately 8 million people every year. 8 million. That's not a statistic that becomes easier to process the more times you repeat it. We know that tobacco companies were aware of the serious health risks of their product for decades before they disclosed them publicly, and that they actively worked to suppress, delay, and discredit the research that was building that case. We know that they deliberately manipulated nicotine levels in cigarettes to maximize addictive potential. We know all of this. It is documented, litigated, publicly available. And yet, hundreds of millions of people around the world still smoke, which is the part of this story that circles back every time to those 4 tiny seeds in a fireplace in a desert that used to be a marsh. Back to the smudge. Back to 12,300 years ago. No companies, no advertising, no wars, no colonies, no cigarette machines, no health warnings, no nicotine patches. Just a person sitting by a fire in the Ice Age who had made the deliberate decision to walk to the hills, gather a plant that made them feel something they couldn't put into words, and carry it back to camp. What they felt at that fire, with those seeds in the ashes, that was the beginning of all of it. Not the addiction, not yet. Not the empires, not yet. Not the disasters, not yet. Just a human being reaching for a feeling that was different from ordinary life. That made the edges of the world slightly softer, or slightly sharper, or slightly more connected to something beyond the immediate. That instinct didn't start with tobacco. Humans have been seeking altered states through plants, through music, through movement, through ritual, since before we have any record of anything. But tobacco is perhaps the most documented case study we have of what happens when that ancient, pre-language, pre-civilization instinct collides with capitalism, colonialism, addiction science, and industrial-scale production. We took something that began as a sacred walk up a hillside and turned it into the leading preventable cause of death on Earth. That transformation didn't happen in one moment. It happened across 12,000 years of accumulated choices, discoveries, exploitations, and dependencies. Every step made sense to the people taking it. The hunter-gatherer was just gathering a plant. The Mayan priest was just honoring the gods. Columbus's crew were just curious. The physician was just treating headaches. The tobacco company was just filling market demand. And 8 million people a year die from the cumulative result of all those individually sensible-sounding decisions. If there's a lesson here, it might be something uncomfortably simple: that humans are spectacularly good at finding things that change how we feel, and spectacularly bad at predicting what we'll eventually do with them at scale. The seeds in the Utah desert are 12,300 years old. The instinct behind them is older than that. And we are, in some form or another, still living inside the consequences of that first decision, just with better packaging and significantly worse outcomes.